Welcome everybody here to the bi-weekly Cups and Cakes seminar of RIS for CIVIS. My name is Peter Gradul. I'm the Vice President of the University of Tübingen for research. The University of Tübingen has one of the key research areas in environmental sciences, and actually my background picture here is the brand new Center for Geo and Environmental Sciences. I'm happy that I could actually win my colleague Todd Ehlers to give the presentation here. He's from the geosciences. He holds a PhD in geophysics, and he is professor since 2009 for geosciences at the University of Tübingen. At the same time, he is visiting professor at the University of Michigan. He has a number of awards. For example, he's the Moore Distinguished Fellow at Caltech. He is a fellow of the Geological Society of America. He holds an ERC grant and so on. And most important in this context is he's the co-coordinator of a German research program, which is called Earth Surface Shaping by Biota. And this is also the topic of today, and you see that already a little bit in the introductory chapter. And with that, I hand over to Todd Ehlers, please.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Thank you very much for the introduction. So in preparing this talk today, I was asked to do something for a general audience because we could have people from chemistry and biology and physics, for example, joining as well. So I'm going to cover a diverse array of topics and focus more on giving an overview of where I think this exciting field is right now. And to do that, I'd like to start with this image or this old map that you see here from Johnston and Henfrey. It's about 160 years old. And this builds upon some of the really fascinating work that Alexander von Humboldt did in South America. And what you see illustrated here are different mountain ranges around the world. And what they've done is they've mapped out how you have different types of vegetation that are occurring at different elevations here, but also shifting as you move across different latitudes here. And in this day, this was the exciting kind of topic that recognizing that not only latitudinal, but also elevation changes had a close relationship between the biosphere and also the geosphere that was providing these different elevations that the vegetation could occur on. What I'm going to do today is come at this from my admittedly very geologic perspective and look at what is kind of the emerging and very interesting field right now of digging into this a little bit more detail and saying, well, okay, if we have these different vegetation distributions around the world, how does this influence the shape of the topography and the processes that we have active on the Earth's surface? So that's where we're headed. Now, as I said, I'm a geologist and I'm going to approach this from a geologic perspective, but don't worry, I'll work in biology eventually. What I want to do is start with the very simple question of how do you make a mountain? And I think many people have the concept here that this depends on, heavily on processes such as plate tectonics. And this movie that we see here nicely kind of illustrates, if I can get this playing. Is it playing? No, it's not playing. Just one second here. There we go. So with plate tectonic processes, basically over many millions of years, we have the collision of different plates intersecting with each other, and you can progressively grow some of the spectacular mountain ranges that we see around the world. And this gives us the elevation distribution that vegetation can grow upon. Now, of course, it's not just about tectonics. That's what creates our mountain ranges. And where we look at things today is also the realization that, let's get this to advance here. Oops, sorry. There we go. Okay. That we also have the destruction or lowering of topography. And this is an example here that comes from the eastern side of the Sierra Nevada mountains in California, where the Sierra Nevada mountains here have kind of popped up above this valley floor here in the last 10 million years. And what we can do is we can pick out catchments here and study the processes that lead to their formation here. And most notably, we can also dissect this in terms of different processes that are active, such as, river incision that's cutting down into the bedrock here and transporting sediment out to the basins. Meanwhile, we also have hill slope processes and soil production occurring here, where we produce loose material from the rock and that gets transported by gravity down slope. Now, that's all interesting, but of course, once we start talking about these mountain building processes and also these erosional processes, clearly climate is quite important. And most notably, what's attracted a lot of attention from geoscientists over the last 10, 20 years is the recognition that mountains actually create their own climate. And if we're thinking on very long timescales, there are significant variations, regional variations in climate that can occur. This is an example from South America. So you have the west coast of South America right here. And what the different colors represent is satellite-based precipitation across South America over a 10-year period here. And very simply, the blue colors represent dry, the red colors represent dry, the blue colors represent wet. And what you see very prominently here is you have winds coming from across the equatorial Atlantic, across the South American continent here, and they hit the Andes Mountains here and basically get funneled along the eastern flank of the Andes here, and we get focused precipitation that occurs there. Now, this scenario, again, from a geologist perspective, is changing over million-year timescales as we build these mountain ranges. We're going to be changing a lot of the geologic observables that we might be interested in, and of course, also influencing the vegetation and biota that occur in these areas as well. Now, climate change occurs on a variety of different scales. It doesn't just have to be on these million-year timescales, as we all know. And what this image here shows, this is just an example from some work we did looking at changes in precipitation globally from the last glacial maximum compared to the pre-industrial period, which is around the year 1870. And what's colored here, these color variations you see are the differences between these two things. And you can think of this kind of as the difference map of how different Earth's climate is during a glacial period. And these alternating red and blue spots that you see here, these are on the order of 200 to 500% variations in precipitation that are occurring. So what we have here is this kind of combination of factors where on a very long time scale, mountain building processes can alter our global and regional climate. And then superimposed on this is the regular kind of oscillation of climate occurring on a very diverse range of timescales here. So where does this bring us then? Well, again, from a geosciences perspective here, the paradigm that much of the community has been working on over the last 20 years is that there's this interaction between tectonics and climate what are producing the topography and the mountain ranges we see here. And conceptually, this is pretty easy to understand. I mean, I laid out in the previous slides the basic components here that in processes that we need to consider here. What's interesting though is this has been extremely difficult to quantify and predict. And there's a lot of activity going into trying to understand these interactions. So that's the state of the art from a geologist's perspective. But let's wait a minute here. What does this talk have to do about the biosphere? So I titled the talk around, Geo-Biosphere interactions. And when we look at a very beautiful patch of soil sitting here, and we start thinking about, well, how do the geologic processes and the climate processes interact with this? Well, the amazing thing is to think about is that if you have these beautiful little plants coming up and growing here, the natural question is, how is this interacting with all these other processes I just told you about here? And conceptually, if you think through this, there are a lot of different things that could be going on here. For example, the plants need to grow. So they're going to be harvesting nutrients from the soil and also from the atmosphere. But as these things grow and are kind of chemically modifying and interacting with the near surface here, they're also creating barriers for flow of mass across this surface. So for example, if this was an inclined surface and we had rainfall coming down on top of this, there would also be a physical component to how this vegetation would be interacting with the geosphere. Question is this important? I mean, it's a cute little video here, but does it matter if you have a tree on a hill slope or not, or if you have different densities of vegetation across the Earth's surface? This was an idea and a research topic that caught the attention of people about 60 years ago. And in a very landmark paper here by Longbine and Schoem in the mid-1900s, what they realized was that if they looked at different river basins around the world and looked at what the effective precipitation is coming down on these river basins here, and they then looked at what the sediment yield was within these rivers. So in other words, how much are these different rivers eroding here? What they realized was actually a very non-intuitive result. What does make sense in this plot is that as you go from no precipitation and increased precipitation, that erosion rates would increase. And this is the curve that everyone would kind of expect. But what wasn't expected was that this would roll over and decrease here. In other words, as you go to higher and higher magnitudes of rainfall and precipitation on an area, you actually get lower and lower rates of erosion within rivers around the world. Now, they interpreted this, as I kind of illustrate here, is that these transitions in mean annual precipitation across these areas correspond with different ecosystems and biomes that are present there. And that the conclusion they came to is that actually, the more, as you increase the amount of vegetation on the Earth's surface, well, you can actually be decreasing erosion. Very counterintuitive result. To a geoscientist. Now, truth be told, there are actually only 6 data points in this plot, and they're nicely interpolated between those data points. And in the following 60 years or so, a lot of different people started thinking about this and wanted to measure this in different places around the world. And in 2001, a compilation of all the following studies that had tried to reproduce this curve came out. And this is what it looks like. So the axes are basically the same on this plot here. We're looking at mean annual precipitation versus the erosion rate of rivers. And each curve here comes from a different study, from a different part of the world, different geologic setting, different rock types, all sorts of different variables in there. And in fact, this curve I show you on the left-hand side here is actually buried in there as well. The key point is when you see a figure like this is just like, okay, we clearly don't understand what's going on here. And what I'm representing here is just the simple aspect of how does vegetation influence the physical transport of mass across the Earth's surface here. So this type of plot here raises a lot of interesting hypotheses about how actually does the vegetation influence and interact with the Earth's surface. That, my friends, was kind of an introduction for the concepts I want to get at today. And what I'm going to do in the remainder of this talk here is try and get at this basic problem here of how does biota influence the evolution of the Earth's surface. And I'm going to do this through the following 2 points that you see here. The first thing is, as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm going to start with an overview for a general audience of what the challenges and linkages are between the geosphere and the biosphere, and some of the different approaches and ways that people look at this problem. Then, and the second part of this talk here, what I'll do is we'll take a field trip to my favorite continent, and we'll go to the west side of South America here, and I'll give you just one example of how we can study these geo-biosphere interactions. So let's start with the first point here. What are the different processes that are active here? In my previous examples, I highlighted physical transport at the Earth's surface and kind of the recognition that biota play an important role on that. There's been a lot of other work also trying to understand the chemical breakdown of rocks, which we also call weathering in the geosciences. What this figure shows you here is, it comes from a review paper, and they look at a variety of different minerals that are common near the Earth's surface, in particular these down here. And what is shown here with the numbers in parentheses are the weathering rate in years to break down a 1 millimeter size mineral. Now, what's interesting about this is this was entirely a laboratory experiment that was done. They basically took different minerals and tried to dissolve them with different amounts of water and carbon dioxide or carbonic acid to look at the rates of dissolution. What stands out here is the extremely long timescales that are involved. In other words, if you are in an abiotic world, such as a laboratory in the building I'm in, well, aside from the humans, the timescales are easily 500,000 to 34 million years to break down a 1 millimeter size mineral here. And this was an important result because what people realized when they try to do similar studies in natural catchments and natural settings, that these numbers are nowhere near right. And so the suggestion is that, okay, clearly the biota, vegetation, microbes, animals, that these all must play a role as well in the chemical breakdown of rocks. So what this brings us to then is that we have many different disciplines that are involved in this object of study that we might be interested in. And so let's call our object here the Earth. And we could be interested in different aspects of how this system evolves here. And we traditionally think of this as these different spheres that exist on the Earth's surface here. To a geologist or soil scientist, it's the lithosphere or pedosphere. We have the hydrosphere, atmosphere, and also the biosphere here. The bottom line is that in reality, we have a variety of different disciplines that I list here. And all of these different disciplines, which are present in almost all of the universities that are part of CIVIS here, are interested in some aspect of one of these different areas here. But these things are all interacting. So we can't really avoid, if we're trying to understand one particular component here, we can't avoid thinking about the others. But what I highlight here is that within these different disciplines you see is that there are very different ways of thinking about these things. For example, to a geologist, traditionally, if we rewind 20 years ago, a typical geologist studying rocks and granites and formation of sedimentary rocks, for example, would say, well, it's the geologic processes. They're providing the template that the biosphere lives on. I mean, the geology is the most important thing. And biologists would turn it around and say, well, come on, it's the biosphere that's driving all these interactions at the Earth's surface. Now, so there's a lot of lack of communication, and there still is, between these different disciplines. And it's because there are a variety of different temporal and spatial scales that these different communities are thinking on. And that's what I want to kind of highlight right now is some of the different perspectives that come into this. So I'll give you one example here. Let's just think about the mechanical breakdown of rock. And this would be relevant to what geographers or geologists or geochemists, geophysicists might think about, is that you see a tree such as this growing, and what happens basically simply by the volume addition or volume growth of these individual roots here, they will work their way into small cracks, and as those roots grow, they just mechanically break down the surface. Now, of course, the presence of this tree here will also influence how any sort of mass might move across the actual surface here, for example, fine sediments, simply by the fact that it's going to obstruct the flow of surface water that would go over this. Now, that's on the scale of an individual tree here. We can also take it one step bigger and say, okay, well, if we look at a heavily vegetated mountain range, such as this one here, a very curious question would be, well, if this biota or vegetation is important for breaking down these rocks here, how different would this landscape look if we didn't have trees on it? Now, it turns out that's not a question we actually know how to answer. But it's pretty fundamental and highlights that one of the first order observables that we face in the geosciences, the shape of the Earth's surface, could be heavily controlled by biota, and we don't yet know this influence here. To give you another very different example of how other communities would look at these Earth surface interactions, let's move to how an ecologist or microbiologist or a soil scientist might think about interactions between the geosphere and biosphere. What you see here is an example, a cartoon of a tree growing and focusing in on the root systems here. And of course, this vegetation to grow has a strong nutrient demand. And there are some very valuable nutrients such as phosphorus that have to come from minerals within the subsurface here. And if we zoom into one particular little root system here, what we find is that there's a whole different communities here of mycorrhiza that are growing, and they have a symbiotic relationship with the vegetation. These mycorrhiza are a fungi, and they send out little hyphae here that will attach to individual mineral grains here. They will extract these valuable nutrients for the plants, such as phosphorus, feed them to the tree system, and in return, the tree says thank you and gives some carbohydrates down to the mycorrhiza. This process is incredibly interesting and occurs over relatively short timescales compared to the previous examples I just showed you. But what's fascinating about it is the fact that the chemical breakdown of rocks here could actually be controlled by fungus. Now, this is not something that we teach in traditional geoscience courses, but is very common knowledge within these types of communities here. So if we think about the combination of these different things here, what I've illustrated to you so far through some of these examples here is that vegetation plays an important interaction with the Earth's surface through physical processes. I gave the root breakdown example here, but here's another example of how if you remove the vegetation over this hill slope here, that erosion rates accelerate and you can more rapidly move mass out of the system here. We can also look at this system as having chemical and biological processes that interact both on the scope of root systems that grow here and are acquiring nutrients, and also on the smaller scale here, on the microbiological scale, where in this microscope image here, the field of view is about 100 microns. What you see are the individual hyphae of these mycorrhiza attaching here onto mineral surfaces and basically harvesting out the nutrients that they feed up to the plant here. So those are the scales of that those processes are active within a particular column of the soil here. Now there's a whole nother linkage here to the geosciences or earth sciences more broadly that's important. And that could be made when we look at things such as if we look at the plant cellular or molecular biology discipline. Many studies in these disciplines are interested in processes occurring at the cellular scale within vegetation. And here's an example cartoon from a recent paper where if you're thinking about a leaf here, you can be thinking about the different stresses that are active within that leaf here. On a physiological scale, you can have, for example, water stresses that are influencing stomata or stomatal conductance. You can also have nutrient stresses that are occurring here as well. The key point is that if you're talking about the nutrient stresses or the water stresses, these are very closely linked to the Earth's system. Simply the water stresses driven by climate variations and also variations in soil, but also the nutrient stresses can be present simply by geologic processes that could be removing the very nutrient-rich topsoil in an area and generating stresses on the vegetation from that. So there's linkages, my point is, on even these small cellular, molecular, and even perhaps genetic scales to vegetation and to the geosystem here. There's one last example I want to give here, and this relates to, gets slightly more complicated, but if we start thinking now about the water cycle, which is important for vegetation and geologic processes, then we need to start being concerned about climatology and weather, and also surface water or groundwater budgets here. What you see shown on the right-hand side here is a typical kind of systems diagram that would be used for how a climatologist thinks about vegetation here. And what's going on is, it's not, our Earth's climate and weather is not just a function of these radiation balances that are occurring near the Earth's surface. It's modulated by biologic processes. And very important within this are things such as how vegetation influences evapotranspiration, but importantly also soil moisture, which was not something that was recognized until about the 1980s in the climate modeling community, that this was an important factor to consider. And then these moisture conduits also influence your heat fluxes that are occurring across the ground surface here. So what I hope I've illustrated through these different examples is the many different scales, both temporal and spatial, for how these different disciplines are linked to each other. So if we go to a particular area now, and this would be this is a photograph from central Chile, actually. This would be a typical kind of hill slope you might see here. We see some vegetation growing on this. This darker material you see in the foreground here, these are actually microbiological soil crusts that have grown there. And then of course we have a hill slope here with loose sediment on it. So how would this get picked apart? Well, what's typically going on right now in all these different disciplines I mentioned is that an ecologist would be studying this hill slope, looking at plant nutrient availability, succession of ecosystems or disturbances that might be occurring due to fire or drought, things like that. Plant molecular biologists might be more interested on what are the stresses on the individual vegetation here, how are they responding to global warming occurring in this area. A microbiologist doesn't care so much about that, is very focused on these soil crusts here and these microbial soil communities. On the other hand, the geomorphologist is interested in, well, what's controlling the flux of mass down this hill slope here? And what does it take to remove this very fertile upper layer within the soil profile here? And then if we go to even different scales, a geologist here would be thinking, well, okay, as this, we have a certain density of vegetation on this landscape here, how does that influence the overall shape of the topography that we might get in the setting here? The key point is that we can think about this on different spatial scales that things are occurring and also different temporal scales. And I want to start first by just giving an example here of different spatial scales of thinking here. And that example is based on rock weathering. In other words, how do we break down rocks? And we'll do this from a chemical perspective here. So there are geoscientists and also soil scientists who would look at this on the scale, this is 200 microns here, on the scale of individual minerals here. And that we have mineral dissolution fluxes occurring at these interfaces here, kind of etching out and dissolving material within these minerals here. That any sort of fluids that are containing these solutes are going to then be transported and working within the system here. And that brings us to our next scale, which could be, for example, this soil profile here. And these smaller scale mineral dissolution fluxes are important for the nutrient cycling that's occurring in the near surface that's feeding the vegetation here, but it's also controlling how we convert bedrock at depth into regolith and soil at the top here. So these systems, these different scales are linked here. And then on a larger scale, geoscientists could come into the system and grab a sample of water from a river here and be telling you something about the dissolved and particle discharge within the entire river catchment here at a much, much larger scale of tens to hundreds of kilometers or so. The point is that even on just this one simple process, well, it's actually not that simple, but one process of rock weathering here, that in order to understand this, you need to be looking at this from the microscopic up to the kind of mountain range scale here. But it gets even a little more complicated than that, because what I've highlighted here is just horizontal scales, different spatial scales. There's another element to that, and that would be to think about how deep is the Earth's surface? How deep do these different processes operate here? This is just one example of an area in central Chile here, where this is actually a highly weathered granite here. This is 30 meters distance here, and it probably goes down deeper than this. And this area it's currently mined for gravel. You could walk up to this granite here and stick your finger in it. It's so soft, and you see an example of it right here. You can just break this apart easily in your hand here. The point is that it's not these processes of weather and nutrient cycling are not just going on in the near surface here. They're also occurring at depth here. And what we don't know is how deep is the biosphere involved in these weathering processes here. In particular, this gets to be too deep for fungus, for example, to be weathering, but you could, for example, have bacterial weathering and bacterial communities that could be contributing to this weathering here. So one very cutting edge direction that this is going in both the US and German research efforts is to be looking into now what we call the deep biosphere. And this involves drilling down. In this particular case, we were drilling a borehole to about 100 meters depth. And even at depths of around 60 meters, we would see altered bedrock like this, where there are fractures and alteration zones around this that involve iron oxidation, for example. And these are most likely being driven by bacteria at these depths here. So it's not only on the small and large horizontal scales, but also on vertical scales that were, decades ago unthinkable that the biosphere would be relevant at these different depths here. This brings me then to kind of highlighting different temporal scales of thinking. And I want to ask you all a question and just kind of orient the discussion here a second. If I ask you this question of what does long-term mean to you? I mean, if you're coming from the humanities or history, you might say a couple hundred years or a couple generations. But if you're thinking as a scientist in some of these different communities I just mentioned to you, the answer you get for this will be very different. And this is a challenge that we face here in studying interactions between the geosphere and biosphere. For example, to a microbiologist, what is long-term? Well, it might be a day. I mean, this is the time period over which you could get microbial cell doubling in a particular area. To an ecologist, it could be a season. That's the amount of time it takes for grassland growth to occur. It could also be a few years if you're interested in variations in subsurface or surface water flow. It might be up to a few tens of years as long-term if you're interested in mass transport across the Earth's surface, such as a geomorphologist, or if you're interested in paleoclimate change and how this interacts with vegetation in the Earth's surface, it might be a few thousand to tens of thousands of years. If you're a geochemist or soil scientist looking at how long it takes and the rates at which we produce regolith in soil, maybe you get up to tens of thousands of years. And to a geologist, long-term, well, anything less than 1 million years is basically irrelevant from a geologic perspective. The point is then that when we're talking about these different timescales here, and we have all these different communities thinking on these different timescales, trying to work together, this actually creates a huge intellectual challenge for us because immediately we need to bridge between these shorter timescale processes to understand if and when they have effects on these longer timescale processes as well. So to kind of wrap up this first part of what I wanted to talk about here, I think there's some really exciting opportunities here when we start talking about geo-biosphere interactions. And again, from a geologist perspective, there are very few people and groups trying to think about how the changes that we can measure and observe on these, what I would call short time scales of days to years, are manifested over longer time scales. This gives us a lot of exciting opportunities here. The biosphere and geosphere are linked, and they're linked over fascinating processes that are active over this diverse range of timescales and a diverse range of spatial scales as well. And the point here is that we have a lot of frontier research topics that can be addressed if these different disciplines can come together. Now, this is an area, as Peter Grotwall mentioned at the introduction to this talk here, where we're starting to tackle this with a German priority research program that's called EarthShape. If you're interested in this, I give the link down here. And we're basically going through these different scales and trying to link these things from individual soil columns to the hill slope scale, to catchment scales, and also looking at how all the processes between the geosphere and biosphere active here are also influenced, or recorded, I should say, in depositional processes within areas here. The key here is bringing together these different communities that I talked to you about and trying to break down some of these barriers And what we've come to find after about 4 years of this project already is that we're just barely scratching the surface. It's only now after 4 years where we understand each other's vocabulary well enough to start having meaningful scientific discussions about where the state of the art is in these fields here. So that wraps up the first point with kind of an overview of the different processes that are active here. And the last thing I want to do is kind of briefly conclude by giving you an example from my own research of how these different scales, spatial and temporal, can be bridged with one particular approach here. And to do that, we're going to go to the coastal Cordillera of Chile here. This is a fascinating area to work because what you have here is one of the largest and most extreme climate and ecological gradients on Earth. We have a series of 4 different study areas that we're focusing on here, ranging from the Atacama Desert in the north to temperate rainforests in the south here. The distance here is around 1,300 kilometers or so. And if we look at slightly better photographs of what these areas look like here, this would be the northernmost Atacama region, and as you progressively move south, you get into some shrublands and cactus lands, eventually pick up even higher vegetation cover here, and this is now the southern temperate rainforest area where you get these beautiful araucaria trees that are growing there. The question that I'm interested in these particular areas here is that you see these very different morphologies of topography as you move through these different areas here. And the question is, how important are the different types of vegetation that have been that are present on these areas for what we see in the topography in these different regions here. Now, it starts to be a complicated problem to think about what are the vegetation effects on topography here, because you also have this large climate gradient. And so you kind of have these 2 different variables that are changing as you move from location to location. And you want to understand which one is playing an important role and where in these different settings here. The approach that we did for this was to not only consider the present day of these areas, but also to go back in time with the recognition that over the last 20,000 years, we've gone from having glacial conditions on Earth to present day interglacial conditions. So we've had very large climate change that has occurred here. So our kind of time scale of interest here has been the evolution of landscapes such as this over the last 20,000 years or so. Our approach for doing this was to work with a combination of different modeling techniques. And the first approach was to use what are called dynamic vegetation models. These are kind of the state-of-the-art models. They're also used in global atmospheric general circulation models. They explicitly simulate the different types of vegetation that will develop as a function of varying photosynthesis rates, stomatal conductance, phenology, carbon and nutrient allocation. All of these things are kind of linked to what the state of the climate is at a particular time. Furthermore, this particular model also accounts for competition effects between different plant functional types and how these different vegetation types will be competing for space, water, nutrients, light, that type of thing. In a nutshell, the way these dynamic vegetation models work is that you can think of some sort of environmental space, could be temperature, could be precipitation, and how different species will perform under those conditions there. So that gives you a prediction then for a given condition, say here, what species might be present there. And then of course the competition effects kick in and you modify these original distributions to get an ecosystem that develops here. That's kind of how the dynamic vegetation models work. These are well established. And now what we're going to do is apply these to these Chilean study areas here. And I'm only going to show you results from the Atacama and the rainforest in the south here. What you're looking at on the right here is the Atacama region. And you have time on the horizontal axis going from 21,000 years ago when we were at a glacial maximum on Earth and to present day over here. What's shown in the lower plot here is how the vegetation cover changes with time, and it stays very low, around 15% or so, 10 to 15% in the arid north. And what's shown on the top here are the leaf area index of different plant functional types. And for example, if you have trees or shrubs or grasses or a mixture of some various other types here. The key point is when you look over the last 20,000 years in a region like the Atacama, the climate did change, but not enough to get substantial changes in the plant functional types that were present or in the vegetation cover that was present. In other words, the present day is a really good representation of past conditions within the Atacama. Now, if we move further south, and the effect changes progressively as you move south here, and just jumping to the southernmost location here, same type of plots on the left-hand side here. If we look at vegetation cover in that area here, it stays about the same. Please ignore this dark black line, that's something else. The total vegetation cover stays about the same here. But what we see is that there are very large changes in the different plant functional types. And that's represented by the growth, for example, of this dark green color as we move towards the present here. And these are temperate broadleaf evergreen trees that start to grow in abundance as we move to warmer and wetter climates in this area here. So what we learned from this is that the ratio of trees versus shrubs versus grasses has changed significantly in this area, although the amount of vegetation cover present hasn't. It's just we've been changing what's there. The question then is, okay, that's the change in the ecosystem there. Does this matter for topography? Do these differences in vegetation types, for example, and vegetation cover amounts influence what the landscape looks like? To answer that part of the question, what we've done is taken results from these dynamic vegetation models, and we've linked these with landscape evolution models. And to give you just a little bit of a primer here, this is on how these things work. This is a block of the earth that's sitting within, the model domain. And what we can do is we can prescribe tectonics, so we can push this up at some rate. We can define a precipitation rate on it. And then we have a variety of different erosion laws that we can prescribe within a landscape here that will tell us how rivers or hill slopes evolve here. Now, the big advance in what we did in this was that to take these erosion laws and modify them for the abundance and different types of vegetation that were present there. In these types of models, we're always solving a physical equation, and in this case, we're honoring conservation of mass. So we can calculate at many different points across a landscape here what the elevation change will be, and that this is a function of mass addition to the system by tectonics, and then erosion by hill slopes, or erosion or sedimentation by river processes. I won't show you the next level of equations, but we can expand each of these terms into much longer equations for the processes that are active and for the amount and types of vegetation that are within them. For this talk, what I will do, though, is just illustrate to you how dramatic of a difference you get in the topography that evolves if you just change the amount of vegetation present. So what you're going to see here in a second are two movies of how these blocks of the earth, 40 by 40 kilometers, how they evolve. The rate of tectonic processes constructing these landscapes is identical between these two models. On the left-hand side, you have a simulation with 10% vegetation cover, so similar to our arid north, and a corresponding precipitation for it. And then on the right, we have a high vegetation cover, high precipitation rate occurring there. So as you watch these movies evolve here, what I want you to pay attention to is that the elevation scale is the same in both of them. And keep in mind, these models are being forced identically. The difference, though, over the course of 5 million years of building this topography here, the interesting thing is that if you have a low vegetation cover landscape, you actually get lower topography than if you have a high vegetation cover landscape. And in fact, this is completely counterintuitive. This is the setting which has much higher precipitation. You might expect that this topography would be eroded flatter than the one on the left here. The difference is that the vegetation is playing a first order control here, actually, on what the shape of that mountain range looks like. In other words, to be somewhat provocative about this, plants control the height of mountain ranges. Okay, now that's a big oversimplification, and these are idealized experiments here, but that's one conclusion you could come to from this. Last little point I'll mention here, because I brought it up earlier, is that when we look at outputs from these dynamic vegetation models, so this is now time from glacial maximum to present, and this is the vegetation cover in that southern example versus in the north, we can look at the abundance of different major plant functional types that are occurring, and the blue line here is the mean annual precipitation for these different areas here. And what I mentioned before is you have these two very important parameters here. You have changing precipitation and changing vegetation. So which one is controlling what we see in these different landscapes here? On the right-hand side is the erosion rate averaged over that entire model domain I just showed you here. And you can see that as you go from last glacial maximum to present here, that you get very diverse and different erosion histories that occur here. Now, the question is, the magnitude of change here is around 20% change that's occurring over this time scale. And the question is, how much of the signal you see in these different areas is due to the precipitation or vegetation? We get at that through doing a lot of statistical analysis, basically correlation analysis and clustering analysis between the climate and the vegetation changes. The key point is that if you're in an arid setting here, it's the climate that's most important. The vegetation can't expand and cover enough of the area for the climate changes seen there to make an appreciable difference. Whereas in the south, it turns out that the amount of tree cover that you have, which is the dark green line here, is actually the driver and the primary factor responsible for how that landscape will erode there. Okay, so what does this type of example show? Well, what it did show was that spatial and temporal scales, that we have ways to bridge them with numerical models here. Now, this is just in this particular case I showed you by looking at vegetation effects on physical transport of mass. But in order to do this, you have to have some governing equations and physical processes that you can actually try and solve. And the catch is that what we don't actually know or get from this is that many processes that I highlighted in the first part of this talk, for example, the rates of fungal weathering, how fast is it, or rates of biotic versus abiotic breakdown of rocks, we don't have the equations. We don't even know what they are yet in order to be able to try and bridge across these different timescales here. So there's a lot of room here for future work and activities that can be conducted to understand the interaction between these different processes here. So to wrap things up then, if we go back to our geologists or geoscientists and biologists, I would say right now, at least what we're seeing in this Earthshape project is that, geologists are saying, wow, biota are kind of cool, and they want to be friends with biologists, which they may not have wanted to be before. And the biologists are saying, well, yeah, boy, I'd love to be your friend. Can you tell me more about rocks and how they break down and where my nutrients are coming from here? What this brings us to is that a recognition here between communities, I think, that the geosphere and biospheres, that these things influence each other on very diverse scales. And much of these communities now are focused heavily on what's changing today, but there are tremendous and huge geologic applications and also forward-looking applications to this as well. And our knowledge of these interactions is still quite limited, even though we recognize that they are very significant in the geologic record and hugely important as we face a lot of anthropogenic climate change over the coming years here. And last point I want to make is that I think this topic of geo-biosphere interactions is something that's a potential integration theme for work between the different CIVIS universities, simply because it can involve so many different disciplines, and there's so many big kind of low-hanging fruit scientific questions that can be addressed by looking at these different techniques. Those were the main topics and kind of the overview I wanted to give you. If you are interested in kind of this concept and some of the ideas I presented here. As part of the Earthshape project, we made a number of community outreach videos. You can, if you scan this QR code, it'll take you to a YouTube page where you can see these different videos. They're in English, German, and Spanish, and also different movies, very nicely done computer animations for how plants weather and break down rocks, and how the types of computer model simulations I showed you here. All of this is designed also for teaching level and kind of bachelor's level courses. So that is all I had to say, and I thank you very much for your attention.